Well, as announced, I'm Daryl Smith, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about this kind of a paper or presentation in progress. And each time I give it, I think of some more things that I should add to it the next time. So I just added some more things to it. And so hopefully we'll be out of here by 7 or 8 o'clock tonight with that. But there are a few additions, and there's a lot more things that could be talked about here. First of all, this is the tallgrass prairie portion of the mid-continent North American prairie, which occupied a good share of the North American continent. And of course, as you know, that's the focus of the Tallgrass Prairie Center. But I'm not going to talk very much about the assault on that was to me the first assault on the prairie. Rather, I'm going to talk about some more recent assaults. But just to put it in context, this was probably the major assault on the prairie, and we converted almost all of the tallgrass prairie to the point that today there's maybe 2% of the tallgrass prairie remains. And these figures may be a little bit conservative, but I just sort of tried to break out the periods in which this tallgrass prairie was converted. And of course, one of the things is that we didn't have nearly the technology then that we have now, so the conversion process was a lot slower than it is today. And if you look at this on a curve, you can even see it sped up as we went through that 145-year period. This sort of helps orient you a little bit. These are some of the approximate dates that regions of the tallgrass prairie were settled, starting with the barrens of Kentucky back in at the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, and then through most of the 19th century, with the major part in the Midwest here of Iowa occurring between 1830 and 1870. And of the tallgrass prairie, probably the last frontier was the wet prairie west of the Mississippi. That was probably the last part that was cleared. So, as I said, this is the mid-continent prairie. I'm going to talk more about what's going on in the mixed grass and short grass prairie further west of here and what's gone on out there. There is a little bit of tall grass that will get involved in this, and I'll come to that later. The second assault on the prairie, sometimes known as a big plow-up of the Southwest Plains, occurred about 1901 to 1930, in which they converted close to 6 million acres of grassland to cropland. This is the area that was involved. I took the sandhills out of that because that part was not so much involved with, even though it's frequently included in maps of the Great Plains, it was not involved as much in this plow-up. That's probably another whole paper in itself, because if you look at the map of the Southwest Plains, it shows the sandhills included. If you look at a map of the Northwest Plains, it shows the sandhills included. If you look at a map of the tallgrass prairie, sometimes they include the sandhills. Probably it should be its own area. It's just enough different, I think. So as I said, we're going to be looking at conversion of mixed grass prairie, a couple of dominant species for the mixed grass prairie there, and short grass prairie, and a couple of the species that tend to dominate that particular prairie. Basically, they ripped the fabric holding the topsoil, and there's a legend that supposedly that some Native American saw that happening, and his comment was that the wrong side was up in this whole process. And I think in the next few minutes we'll illustrate that he was probably right in saying that the wrong side was up. But there was a fabric of grassland species that were holding down that soil in the Southwest Great Plains, and they plowed her up for a whole lot of reasons. One of them was that the World War II created a great demand to provide for food for the war effort, and of course that increased the price of commodities, and so that induced people to plant more prairie. And particularly wheat. Wheat production increased tremendously during this period. This was probably the major crop. There was some cotton included in the Southwest planting and some rye, but mostly it was wheat. A lot of it was due to the mechanization of farm implements, especially the harvesters and the grass tractors. They really played a major role in this conversion process. A little bit, and this I tried to illustrate some of the things with the, but right in this period here you can see the wheat prices were really high, and these are, I couldn't get any comparable graphs and I didn't have time to make one of my own, but the wheat prices here are adjusted prices, so adjusted today's price, so they're talking about dollars per bushel, so that's much higher than they were getting then, but it's adjusted to current prices. But the trends are what I'm looking at. You can see here in the from about 1917 or about 1915 on up into the 20s, the wheat prices were really quite high, and people flocked to the Southwest to take advantage of that, producing a bumper wheat crop in 1931. According to the stories, there was wheat everywhere. There was wheat stacked out in the fields. There was wheat stacked on areas around towns. There was wheat outside of grain elevators. Wheat everywhere. And as you might suspect, that reduced the price of wheat. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So these are some of the factors that led to the conversion of the prairie, and wheat being one of them. One of them, there was this idea that this was kind of the last frontier of agriculture, at least at that time. That image was there. This is going to be our last chance to get some homestead some land and plant some land and benefit. There had also been a series of unusually wet years in the Southwest, prompting this old adage, and you find a lot of these adages. Probably the most common one is that the rain follows the plow. The idea being that every time you plowed some up, that would induce it to rain more, and so you could just keep moving west and keep plowing. I also heard it said that rain followed the steam engines because the steam generated moisture into the air and created rain. So there were a lot of rationalizations for rain out there. As we see, not all of them very accurate. And then there were a lot of dry farming techniques being tried that were not good techniques to be using. I already mentioned the rapid mechanization of farm implements, demand for food harvest in Europe. And another interesting thing, obviously, the first time you plant something that's been in native vegetation for a number of years, you usually get high yields because of the nutrients that are present there. So that contributed to this conversion. And there were a whole lot of people that came down that they called suitcase farmers. They'd just come down and buy as much land as they could, plant it to as much wheat as they could, to grow as much wheat to get some price, and that was mainly what they were after. So then these are some of the sequences of events that happened that led up to the Dust Bowl from this. 1929, there was the food surplus, and that was the first time the wheat prices dropped, and then of course that's when the stock market crashed too. So there is a depression going on here. I'm not going to be talking about that too much, but keep that in mind, that a lot of that was going on parallel to the Dust Bowl that was occurring. 1930 was dry, but most everybody made a crop. But the wheat prices were low. They were down to 24 cents a bushel, which was about 10 times less than they were 9 years earlier. So the dropping was already occurring. But then, as we said, in 31 was a bumper crop. And of course that drove the wheat prices even lower. So what's the natural thing you do if you have a bumper crop and the wheat prices are low? You grow more wheat so you can sell more wheat to get more money. Because you're not getting as much per bushel, so you got to get more bushels. So they planted more wheat to make up for the low prices, and then that was the year when the severe drought really cranked up. And this was the time they had their first black blizzards that occurred. The severe dust storms, in fact, the dust storms increased in severity in 33. The suitcase farmers that I mentioned abandoned their land. They weren't going to stick around to have anything to do with it. They'd go someplace else to make money because they were losing money there. They just abandoned their land. That's when the banks were closing across the nation. Roosevelt was elected president, and he implemented a lot. Part of his first 100-day program was to implement as many conservation programs as he could. But, of course, you have to get those things started. Then in 34, the dust storm spread from the original Dust Bowl area and now we were in the worst drought ever in the U.S. Now, 34 apparently was a very dry year in Iowa. I can recall my father talking about the drought year of 34. According to him, 35 was wet, and then 36 was extreme drought again. Here in Iowa, but down there, I don't think they got the water in 36 that we did. So 35, the one that you often read about, and I don't know how many of you saw Ken Burns' film on the Dust Bowl a couple of months ago, talked about in there. The Black Sunday on April 14th was the worst black blizzard of the Dust Bowl, and there were bad ones, but that was apparently the worst one. And they estimate that in 35 there were 850 million tons of topsoil lost that year. Then 36, the extreme drought continued, although some of the soil conservation practices began to be initiated and began to happen. And then Roosevelt, in his second term, increased his efforts to improve conditions in the Dust Bowl area, and then by 38, some of the soil conservation programs that had been started a few years earlier began to take effect and began reducing some of the blowing soil by as much as 65%. And then in 39, they got fall rains that ended the drought. So that's kind of a sequence of events that occurred during the Dust Bowl. Now I'll show you some images and talk a little bit about that. Here is the Dust Bowl at its peak. It supposedly covered about 100 million acres. This was the core area. And Dave Saunders' hometown is about right in there. Right in the middle, right in the heart of the Dust Bowl. So he doesn't remember that, but he's heard enough stories about it growing up in that particular area. Here's a little bit closer look. I won't spend a lot of time with this, but just to indicate that there were even some variations in the core area there, but you can see that this remained the core throughout from 35 to 38. This is where the most severe erosion occurred, and then this pinker area here was severe. This was severe erosion in 35 and 36, and then this area out in here was kind of brownish yellow, was 38. So there were some different. It kind of shifted around, and Ken Burns did a real neat thing. He showed the shifting from year to year, except he ran it too damn fast, you know, that you couldn't follow it. But I thought it was very impressive with the way he showed that. This is what happened. Shows some of the scenes that occurred. You know, sand drifts, a few straggling dead plants around where they tried to row crop, maybe conserve a little moisture. Didn't seem to work, and some of these tremendous dust storms. Had to be unbelievable. This is dust storm in Stratford, Texas in 35. This is Dallas, South Dakota in 36. The one thing that's for those of you, there's the worst hard times by Egan, I think, a book that just recently came out, talks a bit about that. And one of the things that I talk a little bit about is the number of children developed dust lung disease, which was the lungs filling with dust, and a lot of adults suffered as well, but not too many adults died from the dust lung disease, although perhaps some elderly may have had their life shortened by that. But children definitely were, and of course livestock suffered the same thing. In fact, some of the programs that were implemented by the Roosevelt administration were just to buy cattle who were in terrible shape and just kill them and dig a big hole and push them in. Trying to do two things: get rid of the suffering of the cattle, and also to provide a little bit of money for recovery for the people who were living there. There's a whole series of those, cattle and hogs, and some very poignant stories about children recalling that particular episode when they were shooting their cattle and stuff. Drifting sand every place. Had to be an unbelievable time. I just still I'm going to have to go back and relook at Ken Burns' thing again. I just can't quite get a grasp of all what was going on there. This is probably the more traditional picture that we often see of this father and two sons walking in the dust storm. In fact, I think that may be the picture that goes with Burns' one. Another dust storm over a farmstead. Here's one over Beaver, Oklahoma. And then here shows what little vegetation is left when the whole process occurs. And this picture really grabs me. Look at that farmer and his horse out there in the dust and, the air. I can just, I've seen sort of hints of that to a much more limited extent, but just can't imagine the dust thing, and then showing all of how it affected the vegetation. And these are just some of the kind of a collage of newspaper reports talking about different things that happened. 2 planes that had to make a forced landing. 3-year-old Benson boy survives almost 20 hours in a raging dust storm and cold. He walked 8 miles from his home. Farmers fight to stop losses by a dust bowl. All of these things that were occurring. By 1940, when the dust storm was, or when the dust bowl was pretty much considered over, 250 million people had moved out of the plain states. These are some of the migrations route. I think most of us have the impression from Steinbeck's novel, Grapes of Wrath, that most of the migration was to California. That was just one of the migratory patterns. There was another one where people moved over into western Colorado, up into Washington and Oregon. And then the other thing that I learned in this whole process is it wasn't just the Dust Bowl people that moved. There were people from Georgia and Mississippi that went on out to California as well. And it wasn't just farmers. In fact, farmers may have made up less than half of the ones that went. That's a hard figure to get a hold of, and I saw varying amounts of the people that moved. But so there were a lot of people who migrated out of the Dust Bowl area. And of course, remember, as I said, there was a depression going on during this time too. So you couldn't raise crops, and there wasn't any work. I mean, it was just a very difficult time. And you can see a lot of pictures like this of people traveling on the road to get away from the dust storm. Another film that was done by Per Lorenz that has some of this, and Burns includes some of that footage, The Plow That Broke the Plains. You may have seen that too. Causes of the Dust Bowl, they were probably multitudes. We talked about breaking the fabric of the topsoil, which probably was one of the major ones. Hugh Bennett, who was the founder and head of the Conservation Service, said the basic cause was we tried to impose upon the region a system of agriculture which the plains were not adapted to. So that was his take on the cause of it. So that was the Dust Bowl a little bit, and one of the things that I mentioned the conservation programs, but the federal government, I think, purchased something like 4 million acres of land in that area and actually took bulldozers in and moved the soil back in place and planted grasslands to help recover the process. And then, of course, they were also encouraging farmers to plant windbreaks and other types of things to slow down the wind. So those were some of the conservation practices that were used with that. And it's kind of interesting, some of these farmers that started to use these conservation practices saw that they were effective. They did stop the sand, but the people upwind weren't using them, so they were still getting soil drifted down on them. And they were demanding that the government impose martial law and make those people use conservation practices. Nothing much came of that, but they were very angry and tried to get that through. Okay. Then, in the 50s, we're out of the Dust Bowl. The war has changed a lot of things. World War II has changed a lot of things. So we're on a roll. And then in the 50s, we sort of relapsed because the wheat prices started to soar again as a result of World War II. And many of the farmers returned to their old practice of plowing up as much as they could. The suitcase farmers came back because they thought they could make some money there. And so millions of vulnerable acres were once again plowed. And the dust blew when the drought returned. The only thing was it wasn't nearly as bad because many farmers had continued to use conservation practices, and so that helped mitigate the whole thing. And I mentioned the government had purchased and replanted grass on 4 million acres of restored croplands. So those two things helped, and the drought was much shorter and less intense. So that helped. But another opportunity, some of the farmers started tapping the Ogallala Aquifer for irrigating to replace the water in the drought. And that started another whole trend that we could probably have a talk all about that. I'm not going to, but you've read enough about the Ogallala Aquifer and what's going on there. It was a source of water for their irrigation, and they became one of the many users of the aquifer. And you've all heard stories about what's happening there and how it's, we're mining that aquifer and it's going down and it's not being replenished at the rate it's being depleted. So now we're back to what I would consider perhaps a more current assault on the prairie, and that's what's occurring in the northern Great Plains right now. It seems like the cropland conversions are moving north and west, or as some people say, the corn belt's moving west. I got a little hint of that when I traveled in the west over the last 15 or 20 years. It seemed like every time it was a little bit further west than I thought it ought to be. When we talk about the Great Plains, we're talking mostly about Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, some of western Minnesota, Canadian provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. And actually the Nature Conservancy gauges right now that grassland conversion in that area is going on at an annual rate of about 1.2%, and that's faster than the deforestation that's occurring in the rainforest. This is an overall map. I'm not going to spend time on the whole map, but just to illustrate that here's where most of the conversion's occurring. You can see there's some out other places, but here's where the bulk of it's occurring. And from 2008 to 2011, 23 million plus acres of grassland, wetlands, shrubland converted to cropland. And it hasn't slowed down. This is sort of a breakout of some of the 28 million by state, and I'll come to this. Iowa's included in this breakout, and I'll show you why in a moment. There also show some of the states further south too. Oklahoma and Texas are in here, so they're kind of talking more about the plains area than just the northern plains, and Illinois is even in here. But these are the breakout of about, you can see, about 17 million of the 23 is in these states. So this is the area generally we're talking about when we say the northern Great Plains. And one of the things I mentioned they've included portion of the Tallgrass Prairie here. They call it the northern prairie pothole region. And basically if you were to draw a line upright like this, up ending at Winnipeg here, that would be the Tallgrass Prairie portion of this. So the rest of it's mixed grass and short grass prairie. So they usually include that in the prairie pothole region in with the northern Great Plains in most of these maps that we're going to be looking at. And it makes an interesting addition to my story too, so we'll go with there. So basically we're converting grassland to row crops. So this is a picture of what's going on in the Dakotas, Montana, northern.
Was that an easy picture to find, Daryl?
Actually, it took me a little while. You mean this one?
Yeah.
I just recently, I think it's just recently been added to the images. And no, it's not readily, it's on a couple of websites now. Basically, I think I went on to, I don't think I got it on grassland conversion to cropland. I think I may have gotten it on Montana conversion or Dakota conversion for that. But I've noticed since I found it, it's cropping up a bit more frequently now. Yeah. Yeah, it is a good picture. It really illustrates well what's going on, I think. And then I just kind of ran through some of the types of land that are being converted. Montana, shortgrass prairies being converted, rangeland, CRP land, pasture land, all being converted to cropland, mostly corn. North Dakota, we got both mixed grass and shortgrass prairie being converted. And in South Dakota, mixed grass and shortgrass prairie being converted. And it's kind of may create a new dilemma for ducks because there's about 16.6 million acres of wetlands under pressure to be drained for corn production, and that's right in the, for you duck hunters, that's right in the middle of the big flyway from the north to the south. And you can see there's some that's, I mean, if you're farming around it, the next thing is try to drain it, right? Be a lot easier not to have to go around that pond there. So you can see there's a lot of farming in those areas that are already being done, and then some that's not. This is a map that I want to put this in perspective because not all of this is native grassland that's being converted. I had a figure here someplace. They did it. The best information I could get on this was a study that was done from 2000 to 2007 of 686,000 acres up in the Montana Dakotas area. And of that 686,000 that was converted from 2000 to 2007, they estimated about 60% of it came from hay or pasture land, whatever that means. Well, I know what hayland means, but I'm not sure what pasture land means as opposed to rangeland. But they typically separate rangeland out as being previously unplowed land. And with the remaining acreage coming, about 26% from rangeland or native grassland and about 15% from CRP. That was from 2000 to 2007. But it's really difficult to get figures because there's also some people converting land to CRP in this process. And there's a real extensive study, I just got a hold of it, I haven't had time to digest, that shows the conversion going both ways there. But it's mostly going towards cropland. It's not going the other direction. And they estimate in that period of time, the 180,000 of that 686,000 was about 1.1% of the rangeland in the 77 counties that were studied. This kind of shows a map of the acres of grassland and wetlands converted since then. And I couldn't get a figure on the exact breakout of this. That'll be coming shortly, I suspect. But you can see it's kind of difficult to sort out the two lighter colors of less than 25,000 acres and 25 to 45, but the others are much clearer. The green 45 to 70 and the dark yellow from 70 to 100 and the red from greater than 100,000 acres. So you can see there's a lot of being converted up here in north central Montana, but a lot being converted all over the state of Montana, North Dakota and South Dakota.
Bigger counties too.
Yeah. What's interesting, I showed this map to somebody and said, well, we're not converting very much in Iowa. And I said, well, guess why? We've already done it. There's not much left there to convert in Iowa. And this map sort of shows that of the percent of converted in that time. And then that sort of shifts see the percentage is much lower up in here, but much higher down here in the prairie pothole region. So what are the factors encouraging the conversion of grassland and wetlands to row crop? And as I say these, you're going to hear some echoes from the 20s. Several seasons of increased rainfall. Where have we heard that one before? Although they're not using the rain follows the plow adage anymore. But they do say that there's been several seasons of that. And of course we have record highs in corn commodity prices. And thanks to genetic technology, we've developed new strains of drought-tolerant, short-season, Roundup-ready corn, which has doubled the yields. And we've got some new cropping techniques that will allow us to work a little bit further west. There's been somewhat of a decline in CRP funding support, so there's not quite as much inducement to put land in the CRP, and of course with the high commodity prices, the return isn't as great. And then another one that we've been hearing a lot about is we have had for several years now, government subsidized crop insurance plus disaster payments, so a whole bunch of things like this, which in my opinion encourage someone to plant crops on marginal farmland. If the risk is less and the return is great, why not put it out there? And so I also just got a hold of a study recently that said, which you would suspect, crop insurance, reducing the possibility of crop insurance would not stop it, but it might slow it down a little bit. And here's one that really threw me for a loop. The increased demand for organic crops has caused them, if you plow rangeland that's never been farmed, had no herbicides on it, you don't have to wait, whatever it is, 3 to 5 years to be certified as an organic farm. So if you plow quote-unquote virgin land, you don't have to wait. So, you know, I don't know whether I should go to the organic co-op and talk about that or not. But it says the same thing. I mean, and I think we also have made you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think we've also made a transition. Organic farmers aren't these little people that we were used to years ago trying to make a start at something. Some of the corporations are getting into organic farming and stuff too. And so they're more likely to do something like that, I think. And then the ranchers, you can get a heck of a lot better return if you're getting too old. Like if I had a ranch right now, I bet I'd creak and groan if I had to get out and herd cattle for the whole day and stuff. It's a lot better return to rent your land for row crops than it is to try to raise cattle and do the work that's necessary for that. And then we've got a lack of government conservation requirements. So there's probably more, but I think maybe that's many of the main factors that have contributed to encouraging grassland and wetlands conversion to row crops. And that's the one I didn't mention, although the commodity crops were a clue. There's ethanol dollars coming there. This shows what's happened to ethanol production from 2001 to 2010. And I assure you 11 and 12, well, I don't know how the drought affected it, but I bet it still went up. It may not have gone up quite as much. But that's the increase in ethanol production that's occurred in the last 10 plus years. Now, I want to raise a question here, and I'm not here to, this could be another whole talk. Just want to throw some things out. Is ethanol production counterintuitive? As many people say, the role of grasslands play in storing carbon's underappreciated. There's been some estimates that they hold about a third of the world's stored stock of carbon dioxide in the ground. You know, we frequently credit trees, and trees may have a slight edge worldwide yet, but grasslands are right in there with them. In fact, I'd like to see a definitive study if we could get one. I think grasslands or savannas might top them. But I don't know. And when you convert an acre of grassland to cropland, you release 60 tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which I'm told is equal to about the annual emission of 30 cars. So, that means some people have done some calculations, and I haven't had a chance to verify these, but it will take a century before the carbon you save by burning ethanol equals the amount you unleash by tilling. I don't think that's factored into the equation. And so some people suggest that preserving grassland as a hedge against climate change makes sense, even considering the environmental benefits of ethanol. So something to think about ethanol. And you can certainly find a lot of cartoons about ethanol, and I've just put a few up here to sort of illustrate to you, taking, that's kind of a play on words, or this one. Corn is good for you. And then here's one who says the tax credit for ethanol should be below empty. That's a little bit of a perspective. And then corn ethanol will work for food. The competition between ethanol for fuel and food. A little bit different perspective of the corn with the tube in it. And then Andy Singer shows some of the things that are involved. Ethanol saves oil and reduces pollution here at the pump, but you're fertilizing, your fuel for processing, pesticides, a whole bunch of things. And I don't know whether you want to read this one, but this is kind of interesting. Hi there, I'm Big Corn, and this is my good pal, the Earth. Hi folks, I'm all about helping the Earth. That's why I make ethanol. It's a favor I'm doing for the Earth. Ethanol helps the Earth by destroying old growth forests in Brazil and wetlands in the U.S. Ethanol helps the Earth even more by increasing pollution and reducing fuel efficiency, not to mention helping to kill off the freeloading fish and animals infecting the Earth. So remember, when you hear ethanol, think Big Corn helps the Earth. So that's obviously not a pro-ethanol perspective. There have been some efforts, as I indicated a little bit earlier, to slow the converting of prairie. In the 2008 Farm Bill, conservation groups pushed for a sod saver provision, which would have made newly plowed ground in prairie states ineligible for federal subsidies until they'd been farmed for 5 years, which might reduce some of the incentive for taking that risk for converting marginal farmland. But at the last minute, it was made voluntary. Primarily because I think the crop insurance lobby and most of the farm groups were opposed to tying sod saver provisions to subsidies. So it was made voluntary at the last minute, but they did say it could take effect if a state governor chose to implement it in their state. But how many would you guess have chosen to implement it since 2008? Well, I guess the question is, will the optimal growing conditions for corn continue in the northern Great Plains, higher than normal rainfall, annual rainfall? And also, I didn't mention that the summer temperatures have been somewhat moderate up there, and so they're not high summer temperatures, and of course they're less likely to be high further north. So that question, and then can we keep vegetative cover in the dormant season to prevent soil loss due to wind? And of course, some of that can be helped by the fact if they do no till, meaning they leave some refuse, and that will help reduce some. But whether that will be enough, so will these optimal conditions continue, or will history be repeated? A few comments here just for something for you to think about. This is a map of last year. I'm not sure with all these drought indexes, but this is supposedly the Palmer Z index, which is short-term conditions, 2012. You can see the drought map here. This is the extreme drought in purple, a little less than severe drought in red, moderate drought, mid-range, gone down to extremely moist, which was down here in Florida and up in Maine and up in the Northwest. So that's one indication that while there's still raining up here in northern Montana, at mid-range here, down in here, they were in drought. In fact, I talked to one of my friends in Oklahoma and asked him if he had any sort of a handle on if the conversion to cropland was going down there at the same rate, and he said he really felt or he'd gotten some inkling. He couldn't. He says, I really can't comment for sure, but I keep hearing that the drought has slowed the process down in the Southwest. That's all I know from that. I don't know. But you can see and they've probably been in drought a little bit longer there and then further north. And then this is a drought monitor for August of 2012. A little bit different perspective, but you can see we're still drought, maybe a little bit, we're only severe and extreme up in these areas. We're not exceptional, maybe just abnormally dry up there. So it looks like drought may have a factor. Whether it will be a drought like the 30s, God, we hope not. And some other information, there were a couple of dust storms in 2012 that actually were visible from outer space in October and December. They weren't exactly the same, but they were pretty much in the same area. You can see this starts up here in Nebraska, comes down across Kansas into Oklahoma, may have even gotten over into a little bit into Texas. I think the other one was a little bit further south than that one. So there are some dust storms up there already going on. And then I was just reading, this was some drought further west. They were concerned about orange snow in Prince Edward Island. So there's been some other problems elsewhere as well. So we are picking up some dust. And then these are some kind of future models. These are some projections for the Great Plains by the end of this century. And this is the low emissions if we don't clear up the air as much, and this is the high emissions scenario. And you see these are projecting 5 to 7 degree increases in Fahrenheit over the next century, over this coming century, and these are predicting 8 to 10 plus there. So it looks like temperatures may be going up there. And we all know from last summer pretty well what drought-stricken corn looks like. We got pretty good picture of that one. So I guess one comment we could make, history doesn't have to repeat itself. And of course we wouldn't. We've got better dust masks now than they had then, if that's any help. We got better traveling conditions, and hopefully we wouldn't have animals like that. But wonder what these children are what the future is going to hold with this particular thing. Wayne Lewis, one of the Dust Bowl survivors, commented, I know you can read, but I'm going to read it anyway. We want it now, and if it makes money now, it's a good idea. But if the things we're doing are going to mess up the future, it wasn't a good idea. Don't deal on the moment. Take the long-term look at things. It's important that we do the right thing by the soil and the climate. History is of value only if you learn from it. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Iowa, just briefly, to kind of help with the context. This is another recent study similar to the other one. This was done from 2006 to 2011 by C. Wright from South Dakota State University, and you can see he's focused a little bit more in this Tallgrass Prairie region here, not completely because he's mixed grass out in here, but Tallgrass Prairie region here and includes Iowa, and you can see where the bulk of the conversion of grasslands to croplands occurring in Iowa is right in through here. Main reason we've converted most of that, as I said earlier. And there's some estimates that some Iowa farms are losing topsoil 12 times faster than the government estimates. Average crop acceptable erosion, 5 ton a year, and they're getting somewhere up around 60 ton per year in certain areas. And these show some of the counties that are suffering the worst from that, which fits that same map. So I went one step further with this map. Oops, I guess got one slide ahead of that. So we're losing ground in Iowa. Now we're losing some with wind erosion, but most of ours is more water erosion. Oops. So, hold still. So what I did is I went one step further with that map. This shows the Iowa landforms, and you can see where this conversion is occurring. It almost completely follows the oldest unglaciated part of Iowa. This area up here, the northwest Iowa plains, and the Des Moines lobe and the Iowan surface, were all glaciated 12 to 15,000 years ago. That's the most recent glaciation, the most level land. This down here was several million years earlier, and so, and then there's some argument whether this was glaciated at all, but it probably was, but way back. So if you look at the topographic maps of Iowa, you can see that the topography is much more relief down here and following that southern Iowa drift plain. And that's where the erosion is occurring. And that's where the soil conversion to corn is occurring. And this is a repeat of that map I showed earlier. So, and this shows some of the concentrated ones where you get up above 20 to 50 ton per acre in these red areas, and darker red are more than that, 50 to 100 ton. Positive sign, Iowa State, in their 2010 Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll, reported that 2/3 of the Iowa farmers indicated that they should be required to conserve soil on highly erodible cropland, regardless of whether they participated in federal programs. I think that's a positive sign with that. And then also the ISU STRIPS project, the early research from there indicates that planting 10% prairie in a watershed is sufficient to reduce soil loss by 90%. That's positive. So it's a question of whether we go with the more old-fashioned contour type of plantings, or whether we take a look at what's happening with the strips, which was somewhat similar but not quite in the same fashion. Now, some differing perspectives about this whole process. I don't know whether any of you had a chance to read it, but in late July last year, Minnesota announced that they were putting together a plan involving state and federal and local funds and cooperation to spend $3.5 billion over the next 25 years to protect 2 million acres of grassland on the western edge of the state, forming sort of a ribbon of prairie down along the western edge of Minnesota. And that's really exciting to read about that one. And if you're interested, there's a nice article in the Star Tribune for late July by I think a person by the name of Marcotti. Josephine Marcotti wrote, I think she wrote an article about that. And then she also wrote a couple of other articles about the plowing. One of them was entitled Plowing Away the Prairie at a Price. And in there she cites some situations. One of them, this Pete Bauman, who lives just across the Minnesota line in, I believe I can't remember if it's North Dakota or South Dakota, one of the Dakotas. And he set up a conservation easement to protect the 5,000 acres that he has, so the conservation easement will go with the land. And that's a positive thing. And he said that he wants to do that because he wants to know that that land's not going to be plowed. But then there's the Hefty brothers, another perspective. They don't want to be told what to do with their land. They're trying to make it better, they say. They quote, "We love ethanol." If you haven't heard of them, they're known to a lot of Midwestern farmers, of hosts of Ag PhD, a folksy cable television show where they teach all the latest farming techniques and technology. And they hold annual farm fests on workshops like tile drainage and navigating wetland protection rules. He said, productive land is an improvement over land in its natural state. Don't tell us what we have to do with our land, he said in an interview. We're trying to make it better. He acknowledges that South Dakota is pretty dry compared to the rest of the Corn Belt, but farmers can grow corn here because of the new technology and the quality of the soil. He said there aren't any better places for it. And he cites the Roundup Ready corn reduces soil erosion because they can plant with less plowing, and the new seeds generate higher yields and less land to fill man. He goes on to say that the United States has the cleanest water and one of the most productive food systems in the world. And he says in a good share of the world they don't care about the environment, they just want to eat. So that's his perspective on the other one. And then another kind of interesting one in Minnesota, near Appleton, Minnesota, a former wrestler by the name of, he's a professional wrestler. They seem to gravitate to Minnesota. And his sons purchased some land from an estate adjacent to a 2,000-acre prairie preserve, and they cleared the land. And part of the reason it was still preserved for so long because it was an area, because of the glaciation, the glacier had left behind huge boulders, some of them as big as Volkswagen Bugs, in their land. And they took, he and his two sons and son-in-law spent, I forget how much time, a whole year cleaning out the cottonwoods and the boulders on that. They hauled out 225 semi-truckloads of rocks that they sold for landscaping in the Twin Cities. And he maintains that their sweat equity has doubled the value of that land. And he points out that nowadays farmers own a lot of the excavation equipment needed for that kind of work. And he said his sons and their son-in-law are ambitious, they want to jump in. And he says that protected areas like the 2,000-acre Prairie Preserve aren't really of any value to his community. He asked, how much land do they need? He referring to the few bird watchers and hunters that might use it. He goes on to say it was once a thriving town, but now the farmhouses are abandoned, the main street's struggling, and then the state plan for this preserve is going to even make it harder for people like his sons to get started. So he maintains that he's got to create opportunities because he's got to live there. And they have to live there. So we obviously have some different perspectives on this whole situation about what we should be doing with the prairie. And this kind of goes back, for those of you who saw our film America's Lost Landscape, we mentioned John Locke's philosophy, and I sort of paraphrased part of his second treatise, but he said, land in its natural state has no value to society. Land acquires value through the labor of mankind. So for land to be productive, it's got to have human labor put into it. And so this is non-productive stuff right here in Locke's philosophy. And that philosophy, you know, and of course he's a very respected philosopher, and much of our governmental structure is based upon a lot of his philosophy, but I really take issue with this particular one of his perspective on that. But it's persisted all through. We can follow it through our religious organizations. I served on the Cedar Falls Planning and Zoning Commission a number of years ago, and a number of the colleagues there said the best land is the one that has the highest and most profit return. That's the best use of the land. Has to have the highest and best profit return. So Locke would be happy with the wrestler from Minnesota and the Hefty brothers from South Dakota, because they're proponents of his philosophy. So the question is, will history be repeated? Extremes like this, or eroding cropland? And there's another whole story I could talk about, urban flooding, that I haven't even gotten into if we start tearing up the fabric. So, will history be repeated? I think it's likely to be repeated. We seem to learn slowly, and we've got short memories, particularly if there's money to be made. Our technology, I'm going to kind of slip into a baseball metaphor because I'm a baseball fan. Our technology may buy some time and take the game into extra innings, but remember, nature bats last. So, questions, comments criticisms, critiques? Yes?
I was struck by the map showing in southern Iowa. I think that's the area where it's been less fertile. The land isn't quite as...
Right, and it's not nearly, it's much more rolling. It's because it's had many more years of valley development and formation because it hasn't been glaciated for a couple million years.
Genetic modified plants or seeds that supposedly have the higher yield and so forth, that's going to be very attractive in those kinds of areas. That's really tough to fight.
Right.
Because
And the land's a little...
profit from it where they haven't been able to before.
And I don't know whether it will continue to be, but it has been cheaper down there too. Land prices have been less. Yep. Yeah.
Have there been efforts in the state to make, or have forest preserves, you know, where there's tax incentives? Have there been efforts made in the state for like prairie preserves and grasslands?
There are some, but they're not as rewarding as the forest reserve one. But like Black Hawk County, you can, if you could declare it a prairie preserve, you can get a tax break. You have a tax break on yours, Bob? Yeah. You can get a...
The problem is that's not set in stone, and some counties that have budget issues are starting to...
Take that away? Yeah.
They are.
Yeah, because it's been done on a more of a county by county basis. There's no state program as far as I know.
Probably in southern Iowa where the county would like to get more revenues.
It's tougher, yeah.
Yeah, it's tougher down there.
Other questions or comments? Yeah.
If there is drought, will the reverberations be as acute as it was in the 30s? And will people in Ohio or wherever really care as to the damage? Will it really be felt by, should people who live elsewhere really care about the effects that might happen?
No, I think that's a very good question. You know, I first of all, the Depression was going on, and it's hard to separate some of the things that were going on with the Depression. I mean, it was a nationwide problem, even though it was more acute in the Dust Bowl area. So, in answer to your question, I doubt it. You know, and I think that's going to make it more likely that that history is going to repeat itself because it's not as widespread. There will be an effect probably in their pocketbook. I mean, I think we're already seeing some of that, but I don't think it's, you know, I mean, there's a lot of other things that are affecting that as well, you know. So yeah, I think you're right. I'm not sure that it will be felt as widespread as that one. I mean, you know, and it was dramatic when the Congress was getting ready to vote on conservation practices. They got hit with the dust went clear out into Washington D.C. and New York. I mean, it was severely widespread. I'm not sure we could handle a situation like that. I mean, if it reached that magnitude, it might be effect, but I'm not sure we could. I mean, there'll be a lot of other things going on, and we might be in another depression. I don't think that. I'm not enough into that to know which was a cause and which was an effect, but they were cofactors in that whole process, certainly.
But today there are better seeds and there's better conservation practices. So if it's a series of dry years in the Dakotas, in the land that has been plowed up from grasslands and pasture, it's in corn now. It may not, it's hard to say, but these rancher farmers, will they be protected? Will there be a safety net? Who knows?
Who knows? That's right. My concern is like on the, and this is a personal bias. Once you plow that prairie up, you can plant it back to grassland later, but I'll tell you, it's not the same. It's not the same. You've lost the native. You farm it for at least a couple of years, and you've lost the native vegetation, pretty much. And you know, you can replant it. You know, I'm a prairie restorationist, a prairie reconstructionist. Yeah, but I always say every year that I work in prairie reconstruction, I become a more avid preservationist because we can't reconstruct to the level that we can preserve of the preserves. Dustin.
I guess my question is, I mean, do you have a good sense of like who is doing a lot of about this? I know you kind of implied that there's a stage where a rancher gets old and maybe sells his land off. I mean, I'm assuming there's some outside interest, the suitcase farmers, or maybe not people anymore.
Yeah, they're more likely corporations now. Yeah, but no, I've not delved into that. Only I've hit some of the stuff on periphery. But yeah, there are a lot of big corporations that are farming large acreages, and of course they can get the equipment. And the nice thing about up there, from that perspective, is you pretty wide open. You know, you can farm big areas with big pieces of equipment, and get some economy of scale with it.
I guess one follow-up question I have to that is, since those organizations are going to be less invested in that sense of place in that community, and if the bottom does fall out, they're probably not even going to care that there's a safety net. They're just going to.
They're like the suitcase farmers. They're gonna leave. I guess they're suitcase corporations now, but they're going to leave. But they'll be back if the price goes back up again.
I visited, some of these are just family ranchers and farmers, because the cattle business is bad.
Yeah.
And find out you can go and plant Roundup Ready corn with these kind of prices. And so these are, I've talked to a rancher farmer who has these neighbors are plowing up these grasslands.
Mm-hmm.
This is near Highmore, South Dakota, okay, close to the Missouri River. And he said these are just his neighbors,
Mm-hmm.
because you can't make any money with cattle.
I'm-
And he does parrot you. He does say, you plow this mixed grass, short grass prairie, grassland, it'll never be the same.
Never be the same. Yeah. Well, and with the same thing happened, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, when center pivot irrigation hit the sandhills in Nebraska. They went in and used center pivot irrigation and converted a lot of sandhill prairie to cropland, and now the center pivots aren't operating, and you just got kind of a weedy mess left there, and a sort of a decaying center pivot system.
Well, the quality of soil too, isn't it more alkaline where you can only even irrigate it for so many years before you have to rest it or something, or is that in more arid areas?
I think that's more arid areas, yeah. I don't think that, well, I think there's always a little bit of a problem of some buildup depending upon what's in the water, but yeah. But the farm soil out there, you know, we always heard wasn't as productive, but I guess we hadn't tried it yet, you know. And of course, you know, I'm jumping things, but you know, the Cerrado in Brazil, they had a problem down there that there were chemicals in the soil that they couldn't do it. Well, they now have treatments. They can lime the soil and counteract that, and they can do more deep plowing and stuff. Now, one of the things you have to be careful in this talk, they're not plowing the prairie. They're tilling the prairie to plant it. In fact, many of them, I think, are spraying Roundup and going and seeding right into the existing vegetation. So they're not, we can't, I was thought about, you know, something about the plow, but I can't blame the plow on this particular go around.
I would say that I have the opportunity to work, I oversee biologists in the Dakotas that work with farm bill programs and private landowners.
Mm-hmm.
And they're in the dumps this year because they've watched this conversion happen. You know, I lost my point. What was I going to say? There are other conditions that we're not even aware of within that individual landowner's world, like property tax policy. In South Dakota, property taxes are based on the highest and best use that you described when you talked about
Good old Lockean philosophy.
And their ranchers are fighting that because it really prevents them from. They just can't be profitable with animals on the landscape.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
The only way that a rancher can stay in business with cows or cattle on grass right now is by putting that land in an easement that effectively, you know, sells a lot of the property rights to someone else.
Right.
But if they're that committed to that lifestyle and that tradition and making sure their family always has grass for farming, an easement is almost the only way to do it anymore, to sell the land effectively.
Yeah. Well, that's what that Pete Bauman did on his. Yeah, that's right. And there are some who are concerned about the land that are doing that, I'm sure. But again, it's probably not a large groundswell of people.
No, and there's only so much money for easements.
That's right. Yeah, that's not a annual. I mean, that's usually a lump sum or spread out over a few years, and then it's done.
So I'd say that it's, we have to be careful not to just blame. The factory farm model is probably to blame, but the corporations that are farming are not necessarily at fault. It's really that individuals have almost no choice in the matter if they want to still be farmers, and they do.
One of the things that's easy to blame too is the bankers and lawyers who deal with our aging farm population when it comes to either selling land or primarily for renting land, because they want to be, the landowner hears at the coffee shop, well, so-and-so got $400 an acre for his land for rent, so I should have that too, and he may not have it. And you keep pushing the price of land rent up, and it's especially difficult for young farmers starting, that you just basically can't start farming today because of the costs. And it takes sympathetic, knowledgeable parents, grandparents, lawyers, and anybody that has their hands in it really expands what this lady was saying. There's a lot of factors in what's happening.
I had a couple of slides later on my perspective, but I'm very, very, in my darker moods, I'm not very optimistic. I'm not going to stop preaching or whatever it is I do, but I'm not very optimistic because, if you pay $20,000 for an acre for land, you're sure as heck not going to let it lie, quote, idle in your Lockean mind or in your wallet.
The cycle of high prices, nothing cures high prices like high prices, and I think your first slides on the wheat prices, you saw it go up real high price and then should drop. Well, these guys that are, or these, I don't want to say carpetbaggers, but the CK's farmers you're speaking of, they're coming in at the downtime, and when you maybe leave land out of production because the prices are so low, they're just enough later because of they sell the high prices when they get in,
right.
It drops.
Yeah. Yeah, they contributed to the drop, probably. Yeah.
When is the high price?
What's that?
Where does the high price stop? I've heard that saying.
Yeah.
I heard it 2 years ago from a farmer. And he said the exact same thing. He says, well, I'm here farming, but the cure for high prices is high prices.
Yeah.
The problem is we haven't seen a peak as to where those high prices are. And even if we do get a peak and prices come back to $5.50 a bushel, we're still looking at a very high price for corn. Even though it's $2 less than what the current rate is, it's still a high.
Well, and even, good point. And even our, everybody says, well, you're just talking about corn ethanol. There's all sorts of, the more general ethanol being possibly made from corn stover or other vegetation and stuff. And I guess there have been some advances in corn stover and some of this, but, we don't see much conversion of other vegetation. I mean, even if you looked at prairie biomass as a source of ethanol, I think you'd have to probably work out some chemicals for almost each plant species in there, because that conversion of the non-cellulosic or the cellulosic ethanol or to ethanol, I don't think is very well advanced in many plants, even though they keep talking about it.
Can you put a price value on ecosystem services? Have people looked at this?
They're trying to do that, but we're really in. That's a good question. We're really, it seems to me, in the infant stage on that whole process. There was a consultant that was hired for the Cedar Valley watershed who tried to put a figure for ecological services on different areas, and he had, like, for example, he had a very high ecological services for riparian woodlands and they had an ungodly low one for pasture land, and grasslands and stuff like that. And I said, I think you're way off. And he said, well, give me some facts, that's the only information I had available. And that's, for so long we were talking about the forests were going to be our big saviors in the carbon situation. And I think the grasslands are just as possible as the forests, maybe more so. Well, I'm still working on this presentation. I've got to hone it down and focus it a little bit more. So if you have any suggestions, email them to me too.
I've heard some figures about the amount of tile per square mile, something like 16 miles of tile per square mile in farmland. I don't know if that's right or not, but I'm curious about the hydrology of when we get these rain events, 3-4 inches, how fast the water makes the rivers rise because of tile or anything, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm just that's another one I'm working on, prairies and watersheds, and you kind of get mixed messages on that. There's one group that says if you put tile in, you prevent the water from running off the surface, so you slow down the surface runoff somewhat, and took me a while, but I think I can understand that particular process. But then it's slowing it down a little bit, but it's still got to go someplace, and so it seems to me that they're still channeling it on down to someplace else. And then the people who are talking about this say, well, we're going to put retention ponds, where the tiles come out and slow the process down there. But they got to persuade somebody to allow them to put that retention pond on private land, I think. Or maybe they'll find a wetland someplace that's got good natural vegetation and we can make a pond out of it, I sarcastically say.
There is some work in the state on the wetlands, an acre of a wetland will, maybe not the right word, to detoxify 100 acres of cropland by running in, and there's like 3 or 4 projects in the state now. Or wetlands where the tile dump in and it's held in this wetland and then it's drained out with a different quality of water. Those are state funded.
Are they looking at what it does to the wetland itself?
I don't know. I would assume they are because it's fairly broad project. The wetlands that they're using are a number of acres in size.
He's referring to what the state is using is what has been done in central Iowa as crap wetlands. And essentially these sites aren't necessarily a wetland site to begin with.
Oh,
and
they're sort of...
USDA, through their Mississippi River Basin Initiative, has a few of these where they would develop, construct it. The site isn't a wetland, or it was traditionally a wet meadow, and you're going to dump some tile here, and you're either going to stage it, and then you're going to use vegetation to try to somehow pull out the nutrient as it goes by.
So they're reconstructed wetlands then?
Right, or constructed. They're not even restored or enhanced or anything like that. It's just soil that'll hold water reasonably before it passes through the system. So essentially there's enough coming out of the field into this area, so we're not treating a problem, we're just sticking something on the landscape to kind of solve our problem before it gets into the surface body. But I don't know if there's been much with the vegetation, and if you keep dumping nitrogen into a wetland, eventually it's going to go to a nutrient-rich side. It's no longer totally cycling things around.
Yeah. Well, I know there's certainly been a lot of increased pattern tile draining, because I understand now you can take that off of your income some way.
Appreciable property, just like buying a tractor.
Yeah, so that's a reason for you can do it. And I know a lot of it got out here, and I just talked this morning to a former student who's now working on a graduate degree in South Dakota, and he said, man, you wouldn't believe what they're doing up in and around South Dakota State area and stuff where he's at up there. Pattern draining is just, pattern tile just everywhere.
And it's changing the hydrology on the landscape to where road departments are having to raise roadways, and old farmsteads are, that sit in low areas are becoming flooded, and so people people are seeing water in places they've never
Never
seen
seen
it
it
before. And some of them understand where that's coming from, and a lot of them just don't.
Don't understand.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for staying as long as you have. And like I said, if you got any more suggestions to include, it's Daryl, Daryl Smith @uni.edu. Send me your suggestions. I'd appreciate them. Trouble is, the thing, I got to watch it. It just keeps growing.